going to be Haggai tonight, so you can turn there. 2 chapters, not a lot. Pretty easy homework assignment for this week. Haggai, maybe an interesting book for us, a hard one sometimes to maybe see some relevance in, but I think we'll see that as we talk and as we sort of share in this book together. It begins in chapter 1, verse 1, with a date, the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. So there's quite a bit in this first verse that we just sort of need to deal with by way of introduction. Haggai, we don't know much about, very little. In fact, mostly anything we know about him is from this book, and that's not much. He's mostly just sort of a mouthpiece. There's tradition about him and things like that, but not anything really in the Bible about him, other than in this book Haggai. He also appears briefly in Ezra chapters 5 and 6, just a mention of him. And so you can look over there. We'll probably look over there in a little while just to sort of see that mentioned. But and it's in connection with building the temple, which is really what Haggai's main focus is going to be. There's some more to his prophecy, but he seems to be mainly focused on rebuilding the temple. Now, why rebuilding the temple? What happened to the temple? Why did the temple need to be rebuilt? Okay, it was destroyed. It was destroyed. We've talked about the Babylonian exile, right? That when the Babylonians came over a period of about 14 years, there were 3 deportations and a lot of damage done to Jerusalem, and eventually the destruction of the breaking down of the walls of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the nation of Judah, the nation of Israel, remnants of Israel ceased to exist, and were taken away into captivity. Ceased to exist as a separate kingdom. That was under the Babylonians. Now, who is King Darius? Did anybody have a chance to Wikipedia Darius or Google Darius or try to find out any information about King Darius?
He was known as Darius the Great.
And Darius the Great. You know he's pretty important if he's known as the Great is appended to his name, right? I don't know if he called himself that or if that came about later, but yeah, he was known as Darius the Great. Why the Great? What's so great about him?
He was a Persian ruler.
He was a Persian ruler. We're past the Babylonians now as we get to the book of Haggai. This time period, the Babylonians have taken everyone into exile in last deportation 586 BC. The Babylonian kingdom didn't last a whole lot longer than that. Lasted just about not quite 70 years, and the Persian kingdom overran them and overran the city of Babylon, and kind of overnight, the Babylonian kingdom became the Persian kingdom. Persians are people from Iran, the area we know as Iran, and they had sort of overrun the known world and had one of the great kingdoms in the ancient Near East and ancient Near Eastern history. If you go to what used to be called the Oriental Institute and is now called I can never think of it. It's University of Chicago, the Institute for Near Eastern Studies or something like that it's called. They have a great exhibit on the Persian Empire. And you can go and see some pretty neat artifacts from that part of the world in that time. I think there's even some stuff from Darius's time. Maybe not.
Calls him the king, but not the record of the person time that he would have been there, right? So there's some. Oh, that he was a regent for somebody else that was off on campaign or something.
There is some question about, yeah, what exactly is meant by that. But we do know of Darius the Great and do know of his place as some sort of ruler, whether, as you said, a regent for someone else. But sometimes those king lists as well were affected by who created. And, so there might be some people who've been president of the United States that you'd leave out if you had a list to make, and so that's potentially, yeah, what happened.
I saw him in second grade that said he was from Media.
The Medes and the Persians, right, were two sort of separate but related peoples that came together to create what we kind of know of now as the Persian Empire or the Median Persian Empire. But yeah.
He also was known for his administrative genius, great buildings, his projects toward benevolence toward diverse people. And I think he was must have been a pretty good king.
He lasted for a long time in an era and part of the world where kings didn't always last for a long time, especially if they weren't good ones. He ruled from 522 to 486. So, and he died of natural causes, which also was unusual for ancient Near Eastern kings to die of natural causes. And unless a natural cause is a sword in your back. I mean, I guess that's a natural cause of death, but you get my drift. So he lived until 486, and so that would make the second year of King Darius, 520 BC. We can even go as far as a pretty close approximation of month and date. It would be what we know of as August 29th, 520 BC, when the first prophecy to Haggai came, or came through Haggai, the text says. And who was it to? Who was this prophecy addressed to? This is another sort of interesting thing about Haggai. This prophecy is addressed to specific people, which is kind of unusual.
Zerubbabel and Joshua.
Zerubbabel and Joshua. Joshua, son of Jozadak, just to make sure we're not very confused and thinking of Joshua who fought the Battle of Jericho. This is a different Joshua, a common name in Israel. It means Yahweh saves, God saves. And this man, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah. Zerubbabel was a governor. We see him in Ezra, and we see him in a couple of genealogies in Chronicles. We see him in Zechariah. He comes up quite a lot because he's an official, probably placed over the exiles of Israel as they're returning to their native land, because one of the differences between the kings of Persia, the kingdom of Persia, and the kingdom of Babylon is the Persians didn't mind people going back to their homelands and rebuilding their temples. Babylonians didn't want any of that. They wanted everybody just to be good Babylonians. But the Persians were willing to allow return. So Cyrus, who was an earlier Persian king, allowed the return. And so you have Ezra and Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel led one of the first, if not the first, return to the Promised Land and resettlement of Jerusalem. And so he's an important official.
He's the grandson of Jeconiah the king.
That was literally my next statement. That's exactly right. He was the grandson of Jeconiah, which meant there was some sort of royal dynasty sort of overtones, right, to his being appointed. Actually, kind of a brave move by the Persians to appoint a guy who has, royal blood to a government position. Usually, you'd kill those people, or you would marginalize them, but the Persians didn't seem to have a problem with that. And Zerubbabel is placed in this important position as governor on behalf of Persia, I'm sure, over the returnees to Jerusalem. Linda mentioned the administrative stuff around Darius. Darius seems to be the one who created or at least expanded what were known as satrapies, which were provinces or sort of governmental districts throughout the Persian kingdom. And there was one over that Zerubbabel probably was in charge of, or a sub satrapy or something. Anyway, so these are the people, and then the high priest. We know what the high priest is. What's the high priest? Don't we know what the high priest is?
It used to came from Aaron, right?
Okay. Though there was also the Zadokite priesthood.
He kind of church the temple, he doesn't have that now. So I don't know what he's been doing.
Yes, so you've got a high priest, but you don't really have a temple yet, right? Which is I think one of Haggai's problems, right? That you've got this high priest who has some sort of official role. And the high priest, actually, by Jesus' day, the high priest had taken on some rather powerful responsibilities and you know, had some power in Jerusalem, particularly. And it seems like that's begun to some degree. The people sort of have this, you know, Joshua is this high priest who people can sort of look to as maybe a religious leader of some sort, or a person who helps them to understand the law and keep the law here in this foreign land and in these difficult circumstances. So these are the two people to whom this prophecy comes. It's interesting, right? God sends Haggai largely to two people. Now, some of the things he says seem to be addressed to everyone else as well. But specifically, he's sent to these two men who are in these positions of power. And what is the message? Somebody read 2 through 4 for us.
This is what the Lord already says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? So
this is the message, right? The people are saying, you know, we got other priorities than rebuilding the temple. And it's not time yet. And God says through Haggai, oh, but is it time for you to build, you know, to live in your paneled houses? That could have to do with luxury, or it might just mean your houses are finished, right? Right? Yeah, you've got your houses done. You've got all the finishes in, and you know the kitchen cabinets have come, and you know, and you've painted, and you know, new roofs. Everything's good in your house. So now it's time to turn and focus on rebuilding the temple. We're going to talk a lot about the temple for the next few minutes, but that's the message. Verse 5, this is what the Lord Almighty says: give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says: give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. So what does God tell them?
To get his house built.
Get the house built. And here's, have things been tough for you? Here's why. You have focused on enriching yourselves in your own lives and your own houses. Now, let me ask a question, just to play devil's advocate a little bit. They've just moved from exile in Persia back into, I mean, don't they need to focus on their own houses? Don't they need to focus on planting and rebuilding and starting again?
I think that would have been okay if they were doing both,
Okay.
but they were totally, it wasn't even a plan. to
Okay.
rebuild. I didn't say a plan, they were not building the temple.
They were not building. Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things they thought, yeah, we'll get to it, right? But they hadn't gotten to it. And it seems like maybe God is sort of reminding them, look, your houses are finished, right? You've got the new lives started. But you still haven't done this thing. And that's why maybe things aren't as good as you'd like them to be. That's why the rebuild is not going as well as you thought, as you hoped it would go. I've called for a drought. God says, I'm trying to get your attention here, right? I've called for a drought. I've tried, because I want you to build my house. Now, does God need a temple?
No, but it's in the law.
It's in the law.
The law. It's in the law. I mean, the temple is just a physical expression of the tabernacle, and there were to be the animal sacrifices had to continue for the Jews. So it was in the law. You were violating the covenant and the law by not, getting off your, focusing on the things of God.
Right, right. Yeah, it is in the law. God wants, but so why? Why does God want a temple? Why is it in the law? Why does he say through Haggai, rebuild the temple? Because I say that because we tend to say, and we're very iconoclastic, right? In a lot of ways. We tend to say physical, temple, we don't need a temple. We don't need a tabernacle. We don't have a special cabinet where the communion goes. It's in the closet in the office. We don't have images. We don't have these trappings, and we don't believe God lives here, right? I think we all would say we don't believe God lives here. So what's the difference? Why does there need to be a temple?
Okay.
Yeah. So Matt says God does in the Old Testament. God does through his glory. There's a Hebrew word there, but his glory is how it's often translated. Appears over the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. There's a cloud. There's some sort of seemingly visible sign of God's presence. So he does in the Old Testament sort of establish this residence. But even Solomon said when he built the first temple, remember what Solomon said in his prayer? The whole heavens can't hold you. How in the world can you come and live in this silly little building I've built, right? Even in that moment, as they're dedicating the temple, Solomon is saying, what? God is bigger than this. So always there was the understanding God is bigger than the building, than the representation, than the structures that we build. But God still wants it. It's interesting. It says here in verse 8, build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored. See, I'm tempted to say God wants them to have a temple for them.
That's what I was saying.
Right? It's for them. It's because they need a place to offer their sacrifices. They need, and I think that's true. But it also seems to be something that God appreciates. And it's not the structure, but there's something underlying it, right? And I think it's, we'll talk about that. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, this is verse 12. Joshua, son of Josedek, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent, and the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Josedek, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month. So it takes a few weeks, but they get rolling finally, right? He comes with the message, and Zerubbabel and Joshua kind of whip up some enthusiasm among the people, and they begin the work of building this temple. Let's go on and read, and then I want to come back to this idea of this temple and what it seems to mean. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month, 21st day of the 7th, but now we're into September of 520. The word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel. I'm just going to call it Zerubbabel and Joshua because I'm tired of reading. Speak to Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when I came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. Okay, so as they're building, God says, any of you remember the old temple? Now, there's a good chance that there wouldn't have been too many of them that did. Some people think Haggai was an old man at this time and did remember. I don't know. It's possible if he was pretty young when he came as part of the exile. But in any case, the rhetorical question: anybody remember what it looked like? And he's going to say, now doesn't it seem a little less impressive? I think it's in Ezra when they get the temple built. It's a kind of a touching little moment as they build the temple. People are crying and celebrating and weeping, and some are weeping out of joy and some are weeping out of sorrow. And the ones that are weeping out of sorrow are the ones who knew what the temple looked like before, and now they see what it is now, and it's not what they want. It's not. It's not. It doesn't show the kind of honor to God they want to show. Apparently. But God says that's okay, right? God says, my spirit's with you. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about the less impressive temple. Just build it. I'm not interested. It's not that God needs the glory. It's not that he needs the most ornamental and the largest and the most beautiful and the most impressive. And there's something else that the temple means. It talks about the covenant that he makes, right? Made with them when they came out of Egypt, that he would be with them. And he says, and I am with you. My spirit remains with you. The covenant still stands, which is an important thing to remember, right? It's an important thing for them to know. They've broken the covenant. They've been in exile for 70 years or so. Now they're back and they're rebuilding this temple. And God says, you need to know the covenant still stands. I'm still what I promised you before hasn't changed. My spirit's with you. I'm still here with you. And even as we build this temple, and it doesn't look quite as impressive as maybe you remember, always the good old days, right? Always looked better back then. Things were always better back then. And whether it was or it wasn't, they remember it that way. But God says it doesn't matter.
You see, diagrams of Solomon's temple and Herod's temple, but I've never seen anybody try to depict what this one may have looked like.
Well, we have very little to go on, I think, with that. We aren't really told a lot about what it looked like. Herod's temple, there are descriptions of it from history, and it was pretty impressive. There was, you could see it gleaming from a long way away, supposedly. I mean, it was apparently a pretty impressive structure. Yeah, we don't really know much about this particular temple, and maybe it's because it wasn't so impressive,
Same site as the other one?
Yeah.
Here
Yeah.
it is a different place.
No, they're all built on the Temple Mount, on Mount, what was known as Mount Moriah, yeah.
Well, maybe it's because down the line, Jesus would be in that temple.
Well, let's read a little bit more. Linda, now that you bring that up, let's read verses, starting in verse 6. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while, I'll once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I'll shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I'll fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. It is hard as a Christian to not read that and think of Jesus, right? I mean, I what's desired of all nations, and I'm not the only one, by the way. The come desire of nations come, fixing us your humble home. Is that what is it? No. Fixing us the humble. Heart the herald angels sing. Thank you. There's the line from Haggai there. It's hard not to sort of see, God's filling this house with glory and thinking of Jesus standing in the temple precincts and teaching and cleansing the temple and whatnot. And I don't know that Haggai necessarily had that in mind in particular. He seems to talk about the silver and the gold, right? That God's going to take care of of bringing in the treasure and making the temple glorious. They don't have to worry about that. As God blesses them and blesses Israel, their ability to make the temple more impressive will be there. I don't know, but it is interesting that Linda mentioned Jesus, and so I just had to sort of point out that often for a lot of people that has very messianic kind of overtones as a prophecy of Jesus, and certainly for Christians we know that God showed His glory in Christ in that temple, and that's also verse 6 is the one reference, the one quotation in Haggai from that's the one place Haggai is quoted in the Old Testament. You can turn if you want to Hebrews chapter 12, which is where the quote is. The writer of Hebrews talks about verse 18, you've not come to a mountain that can be touched, burning with fire. You've come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God. That's verse 22, the heavenly Jerusalem. And goes on in verse 26, verse 25, see to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape and they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time, my iPad keeps jerking on me. At that time, his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I'll shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken. That is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us somebody keep reading there, verse 27.
Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire.
That's good. Thank you. My apologies. The writer of Hebrews takes kind of some liberties with the verse, but his point is God talks about shaking the heavens and the earth, but he talks about shaking them once more. And the writer of Hebrews seizes on that once more as sort of saying that there's only one more time that everything's going to be shaken, and then what's going to be shaken is going to be gone, and what's left are things that can't be shaken, and that's what we're receiving. We're receiving this kingdom that can't be shaken. It's a bit of creative interpretation that the writer of Hebrews likes to use sometimes. I have a friend who, because Hebrews is sort of a sermon, I have a friend who refers to the writer of Hebrews as the sermonator, which I think is pretty good. So we can just call him the sermonator from now on if you want to. So just that's the one spot where Haggai is quoted in the New Testament.
I think the idea is that in Haggai's context, that the world was shooken up, and it's the shaking up of the world is a type of the final shaking up of the world.
Right, and there's only one more time that's going to happen, right? And then what's left will be the things that can't be shaken. Yeah.
Right.
Interestingly, in Haggai, I'll shake the nations, and it almost is like him, shaking the nations for their gold and silver to fall out, and so that it can come into his temple, and the glory of the present house be greater than the glory of the former house. And in this place, I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. So even though the temple maybe doesn't look as good as it has looked before, not as impressive, God is still with them. God's Spirit is with them, and he will do what is supposed to be done in the temple and grant peace. And peace is something that they have learned not to take for granted, right? And to know that it only comes through God and through their relationship with him. Which leads us to maybe talking a little bit about this temple business. I think Haggai's main message is make some space in your life for me. Make a place in your life for me. And don't let that place get overtaken by the other stuff, right? I mean, it's so easy to let the place that we have, that we make in our lives for God, to be lost in sort of the push and the demands of life and the urgency of work and family and all the important things that we do, and we do important things. But to not forget to make that place. Because I think if we forget to have that place in our lives for God, it has negative effects on everything else. At least, I mean, have you found that to be true in your life? If you don't make that place for God, if you don't get that straight, it has negative effects on other things in your life. Have you found that?
And I would add to that.
Yeah.
It makes me think of it's making space for God in my life, but also making space in my life for the Christians. When you were reading in Hebrews, it made me think about, and when we talk about the temple and why is the temple so important?
Yeah.
Well, when we come together, we're a family. And so it's easy to be on my island and make room for myself with God, but it has to be an open space for others that are worshiping God too. I would imagine that sweetens enhances the scent of the aroma when we're all together praising God. And I thought about when you were reading in Hebrews, and 10 it says, do not forsake the assembly, do not give up meeting together. The temple is just not for me individually, but it's for all of us not to forsake it, because we affect each other, and it certainly affects me if I'm not making room in every aspect of my life.
That's a really good point. And that's part of what the temple in Jerusalem was for, was it was a place for the community, right? It was pilgrimage. Haggai's name means something like my pilgrimages, my pilgrimage, or my pilgrimages, or my celebrations. And that's what going to the temple was for the people of Israel. It was a time of community celebration. This is who we are. It's not just what we're doing, that's important, but we're doing it together. We're doing it as the covenant people of God. And that makes a difference. And when they were in exile, guess what? They found other ways to do that. They found the synagogue. They developed communities. They developed ways to one of the largest Jewish communities in the world in Jesus's day was in Alexandria, Egypt. For goodness sake, there was such a large collection. There were Jewish communities though all over the known world. When Paul starts traveling, what does he do? Where does he go first when he lands in a synagogue? Synagogue. Goes to the synagogues, goes to the synagogues, goes to the synagogues. Because that's where the Jewish community is. That's where the people of God are. That's where the covenant people are. And so absolutely, that's part of what a temple is a place where we can be God's people together. And we've got to make room for that in our lives. The building is inconsequential, what the building is, whether it's a, building built in the first half of the 20th century, like we're in, or a brand new state-of-the-art place, or somebody's living room, or a rented place, wherever the building is, whatever that is not important. Particularly, what's important is making that space for God and for God's people in my life. Thank you, Colette. That's a really good point, and I think something that we need to keep in mind.
They needed to be reminded of the constant need for the sacrifice, that there needed to be a sacrifice. With this, Haggai reminds me a little bit of Hebrews, where the people started backsliding and although it's different, they were hung, in the message of Hebrews, the Messianic Jews are like hung up on the Levitical system, and here in Haggai they don't care.
Yeah, right. In both cases, though, they've lost track of some important things about the meaning of the temple and the sacrifice and the system, right, and the rituals, and that it's lost its place in their lives. And so Haggai thinks it's important that they rebuild this place. And that when God talks about being honored in chapter 1, verse 8, taking pleasure in the temple and being honored, don't you think that most of that has to do not with the building itself, but what the people have put into the building, because it's quite a sacrifice, it's quite a lot of work, it's quite a lot of effort, quite a lot of expense. And what they do there, right, is what God takes pleasure in and is honored. Somebody mentioned the sacrifice being a sweet smell in the Old Testament to God. He took pleasure in what the people were doing, not the burning carcass of an animal, as much as the care of the people to do these things, to honor him.
When you think about it, there's very few things that we can really give God pleasure, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of them,
Yeah.
evidently.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important.
Yeah.
To rebuild.
That's a good point.
I was just gonna say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, because they built the temple, that didn't have anything to do with their sinful lives. Sometimes people think a service to God, like if going door to door, or whatever, that minimizes the bad things that they've done.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and the part of what it does when we're the people of God together is it reminds us of the ways our lives ought to be different, the ways our lives ought to change. We're reminded of the call God has on our lives and the claim He makes, and how how we can live up to that better. Of course, in the temple, one of the things that happened was the sacrifices for sins, right, being made. And we know that in Christ we have the sacrifice that we need. So Christ becomes our Holy of Holies, our temple, but we still need to find room. We still need to make the place, even though for us, Christ is the place where we meet with God.
We also know that a physical building like this will add longevity to about any church. That's been proven. If you just rent a room, the life of the church, I'm not gonna go that long. But if you have a building, something about it, the physical property, ownership, taking care of it, it has sentimental value. We do weddings here, funerals, everything. It has value, and it contributes to the longevity of the church.
I think it has.
We do it.
I think it definitely has value. I mean, otherwise, yeah. I mean, a large part of our budget every year is spent on the building. I think it definitely has value. The thing is, of course, there have always been churches throughout history that did assembly and assembled in all sorts of places,
Right.
and in all sorts of places. Well, some did. It just depends. I mean, you have the one of the stories I love, China, when they ejected all the American missionaries during the Cultural Revolution back at the first of the 20th century. Ejected all the American missionaries, right? They go back 100 years later, they do a survey, and there are more Christians in China now than there were then. It's like, well, how did that happen? Well, how it happened was house churches, underground churches. It happened with,
They meet somewhere.
So yeah, right. So I mean, the church is remarkably adaptable in how we do things. Now, a particular church, if the building goes, it might go, but churches in general can be very adaptable to how church gets done and how they meet and how they're together. Point is making that space, making that place in our lives. And so that I think is the big message of Haggai for us, that no matter what's going on in our lives, we've got to take that seriously and prioritize making that space, because it doesn't come naturally for us, I think, right? I think that's the problem. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. It's something we lose easily in the bustle of life if we don't intentionally, consciously make the effort.
Well, I think Jesus took another step further, though. Where God is saying, make space for me. Jesus said, what? Put me first. You gotta be number one. So he upped it a notch, I would say.
Well, yeah,
I do that too.
And I wouldn't want to. Yeah, I mean, I think we would agree that God ought to be first in our lives. That's the space we ought to be making for Him. We ought to be making Him the priority in our lives.
Maybe bigger space. Well, Jesus, you gotta make a little more space. I would say.
So, other thoughts, other comments on that. We've still got a little bit of the book to read, but
I think I was just thinking, as your last comment, Patrick, it makes me think about the Spirit of God, right? So we're in His temple, but it's not us. It's not who we are in and of ourselves.
Yeah.
It's the Spirit of the Lord that's uniting us, that is helping us to worship Him. And that's why the building doesn't matter. And I know the comment you made, that we're flexible. The church is, what word did you use?
Adaptable.
Adaptable. It's adaptable, but the spirit is like that. You can't see it. It moves. It takes whatever shape it needs to take to draw us near to God. And I think none of this would be doable without the spirit, right? We would not be adaptable. And yeah, it just made me think about the spirit of God.
That's a really good point. And interesting, Paul talks about how in 1 Corinthians, at one point, he says, don't you know that you, Colette, you, Linda, are the spirit, are the temple,
Right.
of the Holy Spirit, right?
Right.
But then he also says to the church at Corinth, don't you know that y'all are the temple of the Holy Spirit? In the same letter, he says, you personally are God's temple, but so are you as a group. And and that maybe has a lot to say to us about how we do think about God's presence in our lives and his place in our lives. In baptism, he shares his spirit with us, right? He pours his spirit into us. In the church, spirit-filled people together, he is present among us. And we should take that more seriously and think long and hard about what that means and organize our lives around that reality. Well, let's look at verse 10. On the 24th day of the 9th month, now we're into December of 520, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Ask the priests what the law says. If someone carries consecrated meat in the fold of their garment, and that fold touches some bread or stew, some wine, olive oil, or other food, does it become consecrated? What's the answer? Don't look.
No, it becomes defiled.
It does not become consecrated. The consecrated food does not make other food consecrated, right? Consecration, holiness doesn't get passed on, is the point of this. The law seems to suggest that there seems to have been some priestly teaching that expanded on the law that made that definitive. Holiness doesn't get passed on. Interestingly, of course, when Jesus shows up, he touches a person with leprosy. He's not made unclean. They're made clean. The usual process is reversed. But in Haggai's time, no. Consecration, holiness doesn't get passed on. Then Haggai said, if a person defiled by contact with a dead body touches one of these things, does it become defiled? So if you touch a dead body, the highest level of ritual uncleanness was corpse defilement. So you touch a dead body and you're unclean. And if you touch something else or someone else, guess what? It becomes unclean. So you get the point, right? Consecration isn't passed on, but uncleanness is. The guy says, so it is with these people and this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled. Now give careful thought to this from this day on. Consider how things were before one stone was laid on another in the Lord's temple. He talks about when anyone came to a heap of 20 measures, there were only 10. When anyone went to draw a wine vat, I went to a wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were only 20. I struck all the work of your hands with blight, mildew, and hail, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. From this day on, from this 24th day of the 9th month, give careful thought to the day when the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Give careful thought. Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you. So his point is, right, that everything you've done has been a mess because you've been that defiled nation and everything you touch turns to defilement, right? It's just, everything's falling apart because of where you were as a nation. He says, but this day is the day you started work on the day you started work on the temple. This is the day you can mark, because from this day on, you're going to see a difference. You're going to see me blessing you. you're going to see things being different because you've made this decision to begin this process. Does that make sense? God's saying, you remember me, I'll remember you. You give the place in my life, the place you give me the place in my life that I deserve, and you'll see what a difference it will. And you'll see how that touches and ripples out to the other parts of your life. And I think that's something we ought to test God on sometimes, just to see if we remember Him, will it make a difference? Will we see it ripple out into other parts of our lives? And I think we will. I'm not saying you're going to be rich or wealthy if you remember God. I'm just saying that I think it will make a positive difference in other places in your life. Sometimes it may cause you trouble too. God doesn't promise that that won't be the case, but I think it will make a positive difference in relationships and in other places in your life if you'll put Him in that first spot. Well, let's go to verse 20 then. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. There's that shaking of the heavens and the earth again. I'm going to shake things up. I'm going to change things. I'm going to turn over royal thrones, he says, and shatter the power of foreign kingdoms. I'll overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. I can't help but read that and think of Simeon and Mary talking about Jesus and the pulling down of the powerful and the lifting up of the humble. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I'll take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I'll make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. So there's sort of a personal promise to Zerubbabel at that point. That a lot of people take as messianic. A lot of people take as a reference to the kingdom of David being reinstated. That's a lot of freight to put on just a reference to a signet ring, which was sort of the power. So the idea is, I think, God is the king and Zerubbabel is the official that acts in His name and rules in His name. But it's worth pointing out that in both of Jesus's genealogies is the name Zerubbabel. So just a point of reference as you think about the future from the guy's point. Zerubbabel's descendant was Jesus.
And that oracle is addressed as Zerubbabel.
It is.
That's not something that he was to experience in his lifetime, but we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't say it's the Greeks because he would have been dead by the time the Greeks came in and took over from the Persians. So I can't, we don't know exactly what that meant, but or perhaps maybe the community didn't have enough faith. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't really know, in what way Zerubbabel is supposed to be. We're all sort of taking stabs in the dark, but it does seem to be, I think it's in Jeremiah, there's a reference to God taking off Jeconiah, I think, as his signet ring. If you were my signet ring, I'd take you off, essentially what God says, and discard you. So it's maybe sort of a reversal of that, a statement of the Davidic line. But again, I think Matthew and Luke both wanted us to see Zerubbabel and their genealogies and go, oh. So.
Patty,
Yes, sir.
yeah, I think I'm thinking of something here about the rebuilding of the temple. Seem like I'm thinking when they were exiled, because the question is some of them didn't see even the temple of Solomon before it was broke down, because they are all out of Jerusalem there, the old Jerusalem.
Right.
And two, where they were Israel, all of them defied the Lord because they go through a different things. And when they come back, first of all, they were trying to do something, but God is not concerned about the physical structure of the temple, but they should concentrate themselves before everything that they will do else. Because that's the reason why when they were defied, everything that they touched was it clean or those kind of things were from back. This is what I'm thinking. Because when you see, the chapter 2, I think, 15 and then 19 there, what God is saying, he wants them to put the trust and the faith that their fathers has before through him, so that whatever they will do, he will bless them.
Yep.
And they put that courage to restart building the temple, and God started blessing them.
And that was always the covenant, wasn't it? I'll bless you. I'll be your God. You'll be my people. If you will make me your God. And that's what he's asking for. That's what he's calling them to again. By the way, I just think this is really interesting. This is from the New the New English translation of the Bible. They have these great notes. And they mention at chapter 2, verse 1, when the reference to the question about the house, who saw the temple in its former glory. 21st day of the 7th month was also the day that Solomon dedicated the temple. Which I think is really interesting and really kind of cool. I don't know what it means, but I just think that's kind of interesting. And according to this note, it happens on the same day. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Patrick.
Good night, everybody. Everybody feel better.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.